What would you do if a stranger you belittled turned out to be more important than you could ever imagine? In today's story, a successful businessman, Mark, humiliates a young girl, Sarah, standing at his office door, only to discover later that she's his best friend's long-lost daughter. This tale dives deep into the powerful themes of suffering, injustice, and second chances, showing us how small actions can ripple into monumental changes. So, stick with us through this emotional journey, hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Let us know in the comments. How would you react if you realized you judged someone unfairly? Watch until the end to see the heartwarming transformation and the unexpected family bond that forms despite the odds. Mark Thompson's life was nothing short of enviable. A successful businessman, he had built his reputation in the city's bustling financial district. His office, located in a gleaming skyscraper, towered over the streets below, symbolizing the power and wealth he had amassed over the years. Mark's daily routine was rigorously scheduled, his time divided between business meetings, power lunches, and social gatherings with influential figures. He had little patience for interruptions, especially from those he considered beneath him. On this particular chilly morning, Mark stepped out of his sleek black sedan, briefcase in hand, mentally preparing for the day's challenges. His focus was razor-sharp. He didn't allow himself distractions. As he neared the entrance of his office building, however, his stride faltered slightly. There, standing on the steps leading to the glass doors, was a young girl, no older than 20, bundled in a thin, worn-out jacket, her hand timidly extended. "Spare some change," she asked softly, her voice barely audible above the hum of city traffic. Her dark eyes, wide with a mix of hope and vulnerability, caught his attention for a fleeting second before he looked away dismissively. Mark felt an immediate surge of irritation. He couldn't understand why people like her chose to be in the heart of the business district, harassing, hardworking individuals like himself. Didn't they realize how uncomfortable it made people feel? "Move along," Mark said coldly, not bothering to make eye contact. His tone was icy, a sharp contrast to the girl's gentle approach. "This is not the place for you. Go beg somewhere else." The girl blinked, visibly hurt, but didn't move. She held her ground, though she didn't say another word. Something in her silence challenged him, as if refusing to be broken by his harshness. Mark glanced back at her, his annoyance growing. "Didn't you hear me?" he snapped. "People here are trying to work, trying to make something of themselves. Unlike some," he added, letting the insult hang in the air. He adjusted his tie, feeling that the presence of someone so obviously out of place in his world was nothing more than a nuisance. Without waiting for a response, he brushed past her and entered the building, his thoughts quickly returning to his upcoming meetings. But a lingering tension followed him. Even in the elevator, her face, those eyes, kept surfacing in his mind. He mentally shrugged it off. What did it matter? She was just another girl looking for handouts. His world didn't allow for such trivial concerns. Later that afternoon, during a lunch meeting with his friend Paul Richards, a respected figure in the finance world, Mark shared his irritation. "You know," he said, his voice filled with disdain, "people have no sense of place these days. This morning, a girl was practically begging on the steps of my office. The nerve." Paul looked up from his plate, his expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. "A girl, you say? Did you happen to see what she looked like?" Mark shrugged, waving a hand dismissively. "I didn't bother with details. She was young, maybe 20, and definitely looked out of place. Clearly not the type who should be standing outside a professional building." Paul fell silent, his gaze becoming distant. Mark noticed the shift in his friend's demeanor, but didn't think much of it. He continued to eat, occasionally glancing at Paul, who seemed lost in thought. After a long pause, Paul spoke, his voice low and laced with an unusual sadness. "Mark, I never told you, but years ago, I had a daughter. She disappeared when she was just a child, and I've been searching for her ever since. Every day, I wonder where she might be, what she might look like now." The weight of Paul's words took Mark by surprise. He set his fork down, not sure how to respond. He'd known Paul for years, but had never heard this part of his life story. "So you think," Mark started, feeling a strange, unsettling sensation creep over him. He wanted to shake it off, to dismiss the connection he was beginning to make. But the image of the girl's face at his office entrance flashed in his mind again, sharper this time, more haunting. Paul nodded, his eyes welling up. Sometimes, I think I'll see her somewhere, maybe in a crowd or just waiting somewhere. But I wouldn't even know if it was her. I don't know what she looks like now, only that she would probably be around that age. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The memory of his harsh words echoed in his mind, cutting through his usual, self-assured demeanor. Do you really think? It's possible, Mark, Paul replied softly. It's possible that she's somewhere out there, struggling. Mark's mind raced, the realization settling like a heavy stone in his stomach. He replayed the morning encounter in his mind, suddenly acutely aware of every word he had thrown at the girl with such disdain. His throat felt tight, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. Regret, mixed with a gnawing sense of guilt, began to spread through him. After a moment, Mark spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. If it were her, I think I made a mistake, Paul. Paul looked up, his face a mixture of confusion and hope. What do you mean? Mark hesitated, the enormity of his actions weighing down on him. This girl this morning. I didn't treat her well. I thought she was just another beggar, someone trying to take advantage. Paul's expression softened, though his eyes remained intense. Mark, if it's her, you might have a chance to make it right. The suggestion lingered between them, unspoken yet clear. The guilt Mark felt was now paired with a strange, unexpected resolve. He would find the girl, whoever she was. If there was a chance, any chance, that she was Paul's daughter, he owed it to his friend to try to make things right. Before we continue with this heartwarming story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. This is how you can contribute and help us continue bringing meaningful stories about justice and overcoming challenges. Click the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's keep going. Mark spent the following day in a haze, distracted by thoughts of the girl he had dismissed so thoughtlessly. The memory lingered, an irritation he couldn't shake. He had seen hundreds of beggars before, yet this encounter left a different impact, and the conversation with Paul had only deepened his unease. What if she was indeed Paul's daughter? What if, in his arrogance, he had overlooked something monumental? That evening, after much deliberation, Mark found himself walking back to the steps of his office building, his eyes scanning every shadow, every face. It was past regular hours, and most people had left the bustling district. Yet he waited, watching each passerby with an unusual urgency. To his surprise, he spotted her, Sarah, standing in the same spot as the morning before, wrapped in her tattered coat. She looked tired, as if the day had drained what little energy she had. Without thinking, he approached her, his footsteps echoing in the quiet night. Sarah looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recognized him. "You again?" she asked, her voice flat and guarded. Mark hesitated, caught off guard by the quiet intensity in her gaze. I wanted to apologize," he stammered, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "About yesterday. I didn't handle things well." Sarah tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Why would a man like you care about someone like me?" Mark was taken aback. In his world, people seldom questioned him, let alone met his gaze with such calm defiance. He cleared his throat, struggling to find his usual authority. "I might have misjudged you. It happens," she scoffed, looking away as if his presence pained her. "Misjudged me? I'm just a nobody to you. You don't even know my name." The words stung more than Mark cared to admit. He shifted, uncomfortable, yet unwilling to walk away without some sense of redemption. "All right then," he said, taking a steadying breath. "Tell me your name. Let's start over." Sarah regarded him with suspicion, as if he were a puzzle she couldn't solve. After a long pause, she replied quietly, "Sarah. My name is Sarah." "Sarah?" Mark repeated, testing the name as if it held some hidden meaning. "All right, Sarah. Let me make it up to you. Let me buy you dinner." She laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Dinner? You think dinner's going to change the way people like you look at people like me?" Mark's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. "I'm trying to do the right thing here," he said defensively. "I'm offering you a chance." She raised an eyebrow, her gaze piercing. "A chance? Do you think I'm here because I want your charity? Maybe all I wanted yesterday was a bit of kindness. Just a few words that didn't make me feel like garbage." Her words hung in the air, raw and cutting. Mark felt as if she had peeled away a layer of his polished exterior, revealing something unflattering beneath. He swallowed, feeling an uncomfortable weight settle in his chest. "You're right," he admitted slowly, his voice subdued. "I wasn't kind. I was thoughtless. I'm sorry." Sarah's expression softened slightly, though a flicker of distrust remained. "People say sorry all the time, but it doesn't change anything. It doesn't fix anything." Mark nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. "Then what can I do?" he asked, a hint of desperation coloring his tone. "How can I make things right?" For the first time, Sarah seemed to consider him, her gaze less guarded. She let out a sigh, her shoulders sagging as if under an invisible weight. "Look, I don't need much. I just want to be seen for once. Not looked down upon, not ignored. Just seen." The simplicity of her request struck him. He had spent his entire life in a world where recognition was tied to wealth and power. To be simply seen was foreign to him, yet it was something Sarah craved so deeply. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll see you, Sarah. I'll see you, and I'll listen. I'll try to understand." A silence settled between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Mark had never felt this vulnerable, this stripped of his usual bravado. Sarah's quiet dignity seemed to fill the air, challenging him in ways he hadn't anticipated. As they stood there, a voice interrupted their moment. It was Paul, his friend, standing a few feet away, his expression a mix of shock and sorrow. "Sarah?" Paul's voice was a whisper, yet it carried an undeniable gravity. His gaze flicked between Mark and the girl, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Is it really you?" Sarah turned, her expression morphing from confusion to recognition, her eyes widening as they met Paul's. "Dad," her voice cracked, barely able to hold the weight of the word. Mark watched, rooted to the spot as the two locked eyes, the depth of their connection apparent. The disbelief, the years of separation, the unspoken pain. Everything was etched across their faces. It was as if the world around them faded, leaving only father and daughter standing in the glow of reunion. Paul stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached out, hesitant yet yearning. "Sarah, I thought I'd lost you. All these years. I never stopped looking." A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek as she whispered, "I thought you forgot about me. I thought you didn't care." "No," Paul replied, his voice choked with emotion. "I never gave up. Not for one day. I prayed, I searched, and here you are." Mark's heart pounded as he witnessed the scene unfold before him. Guilt gnawed at him, the memory of his earlier harsh words echoing in his mind. He was the one who had failed to see, the one who had turned his back without a second thought. Paul turned to Mark, his gaze intense and filled with gratitude and sadness. "Mark, you found her." Mark felt a pang of guilt sharpen into something deeper, a realization that his actions had, in some twisted way, brought father and daughter together. I didn't know who she was," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Paul's expression softened, and he gave a small nod. "You do now." A renewed silence enveloped them, profound and heavy with the weight of lost years. Mark felt an unexpected warmth spread through him, the beginnings of redemption. In his heart, he knew he still had a debt to pay, a way to earn back the trust he had so easily shattered. The silence that followed felt almost tangible, weighing heavily on each of them. Paul's hand rested on Sarah's shoulder, his fingers trembling as though he feared she might vanish if he let go. Mark shifted uncomfortably beside them, his usual confidence eroded by the gravity of the moment. "Sarah," Paul began, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't even know where to start. I never stopped looking, never stopped hoping." Sarah looked away, her jaw clenched, and the faintest flicker of resentment flashed across her face. Years, Dad, you didn't find me for years. Do you know what that feels like? Her voice quivered with the weight of each word, every syllable laced with pain. Paul's face fell, guilt creasing his brow. I know I failed you, but I was searching. I was searching everywhere. Mark watched as Paul's hand slipped from Sarah's shoulder, his friend's eyes hollow with regret. Sarah, he interjected, feeling an odd compulsion to ease the tension. Though he knew he was far from innocent in this story, maybe your father. He's been through a lot too. Sarah's eyes snapped to Mark, her gaze fiery and unyielding. And who are you to talk? Huh? The man who told me to go beg somewhere else. Her words sliced through him, each one stinging like a lash. You don't know what it's like. Neither of you. Sarah, Paul pleaded, reaching for her again. I know you're hurt. I understand. But you have to believe me. I never wanted to leave you alone. You think it's that simple, Dad? She asked, her tone cold and accusing. I was out there, every day. Do you know how many times I felt invisible? Like I didn't exist? And then, when I finally try to reach out, people like him, she jerked her head toward Mark. People like him just brush me off, like I'm nothing. Mark felt his face heat up, shame prickling under his skin. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah, I was wrong. I see that now. But you have to understand I didn't know. Her eyes, fierce and unyielding, bore into him. And if you had known, would it have made a difference? Or would you still have looked at me like I was something dirty, something to be removed from your precious office steps? The words stung, leaving Mark momentarily speechless. He could feel his defenses crumbling, layers of privilege and superiority peeling away, exposing a vulnerability he had rarely acknowledged. Sarah, I would have seen you differently, he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. I didn't understand then, but I want to now. I want to make things right. Make things right? She scoffed, crossing her arms. You think it's that easy? Do you have any idea what it's like, living day to day, being looked at like you don't matter? Mark hesitated, fumbling for the right words. I want to understand. I want to help. Paul, who had been silent, stepped between them, his expression strained. Mark, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this isn't something that can be fixed with a few words. It's going to take time and patience. Sarah took a deep breath, her gaze shifting between them. I didn't come here to be rescued. I don't need saving. I just wanted someone to see me, to acknowledge that I'm here, that I'm real. Mark felt an overwhelming sense of regret wash over him. He reached out, tentative, as if afraid his gesture might be too little, too late. Sarah, I know I can't erase what happened, but maybe we can start over. Sarah's expression softened, though her distrust remained. Start over? And what does that mean? Are you just saying that because it sounds good? Or do you actually mean it? Mark nodded slowly, his voice steady. I mean it. I know it's not going to be easy, but I want to try. I want to learn about you, to understand your story. If you'll let me, she let out a long, shaky breath, her arms loosening as the tension began to drain from her body. I don't need your pity, Mark. I've survived this long without it. It's not pity, Sarah, he replied earnestly. It's respect. I want to show you the respect I should have shown from the beginning. Paul placed a hand on Mark's shoulder, a look of gratitude and sadness mingling in his gaze. Thank you, Mark. I know this is hard for all of us, but maybe, just maybe, it's the start of something better. Sarah hesitated, her eyes studying them both as if weighing their sincerity. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained guarded. Fine, I'll give you both a chance. But don't think for a second that I'll forget how things went down. Mark nodded, a mixture of relief and determination settling within him. Fair enough. I don't expect you to. A cold breeze swept through the street, the chill biting through their clothes. Mark pulled his coat tighter around him, glancing over at Sarah, who shivered in her thin jacket. Without thinking, he shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. She tensed, surprised, but didn't pull away. Thanks, she murmured, almost reluctantly. They began to walk, an awkward silence hanging between them, each step a tentative attempt at bridging the chasm that years of misunderstanding and prejudice had created. Mark felt the weight of every word spoken, the realization of how little he truly understood the world outside his insulated life. "Tell me about your life," he said, his voice gentle, as if afraid of disrupting the fragile peace they'd established. Sarah glanced at him, her eyes wary. "You really want to know?" Mark nodded, meeting her gaze. "I do." She paused, gathering her thoughts, then spoke quietly. "It's been hard. I didn't have much growing up, and when I lost my family, well, I didn't have anyone. It was just me, trying to get by, trying to stay invisible enough to survive." Paul reached over, his voice pained. "I should have been there for you. I should have found you." Sarah gave a small, sad smile. "It's too late to change the past, Dad. But maybe we can work on the present." Mark felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of hope that had been absent for so long. He realized that this journey, painful and uncertain, was a chance for redemption, not just for himself, but for all three of them. As they continued down the street, he couldn't help but feel that, for the first time in his life, he was seeing the world with new eyes. The barriers he had once placed around himself, the judgments he had so easily cast, were beginning to crumble, one step at a time. The three of them found themselves in a small, dimly lit coffee shop just a few blocks from the office. Paul and Sarah sat opposite each other at the table, with Mark beside Paul, feeling slightly out of place. The warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, blending with the subtle scent of pastries from the counter. They sat in silence for a moment, the soft hum of conversation from other tables surrounding them like a distant, comforting noise. Sarah looked down at the chipped ceramic mug in front of her, running her fingers along its worn edge. "It's strange," she said finally, her voice soft. "Sitting here with you. For years, I dreamed about this moment. I thought, maybe you'd be different." Paul's face tightened, the pain in his eyes unmistakable. "I know I've let you down, Sarah. There's nothing I can say to change that. But I want to be here now. If you'll let me." Sarah's gaze shifted to him, her eyes filled with a mix of hurt and hope. "Do you even know what it was like? Growing up without knowing if anyone was looking for me?" Paul swallowed hard, his hands clenching around his own cup. "I looked everywhere. I hired investigators, searched towns I'd never even heard of. Every day, I held on to the hope that I'd find you." Mark, observing the exchange, couldn't resist interjecting. "Paul really never stopped talking about you," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I didn't know the details, but it was clear he never gave up." Sarah's gaze flicked over to Mark, skeptical. "And you?" she challenged. "You think you understand just because you're his friend?" Mark shifted uncomfortably. "No, I know I don't understand, but I want to." "Wanting isn't the same as doing," she replied, her tone sharp. "For people like me, words don't mean much. We get promises, apologies, but they never bring food to the table or put a roof over our heads." Paul reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it over hers. "Sarah, I can't change what you went through, but I can promise you that you'll never be alone again. I know it's going to take time, but I'm here. I'm here as long as it takes." Sarah's expression softened slightly, though she kept her hand stiff beneath his. "I want to believe you, Dad, but it's hard." Mark, watching the interaction, felt a pang of empathy he hadn't anticipated. "Sarah, I don't expect you to trust me," he began, his voice careful. "But I'm trying to learn, to see beyond my own world." She turned to him, her eyes probing. "You think sitting here and listening will make up for everything? Do you even realize the privilege you have?" Mark's face flushed slightly. "I'm starting to, but maybe I don't fully understand yet. But that's why I'm here, asking you to teach me." A faint, bitter smile crossed her lips. "Teach you? Mark, people like you don't know what it's like to be me. You have comfort, safety, everything handed to you. You can afford to ignore people like me when it's convenient." Paul's face tightened, and he glanced at Mark, clearly uncomfortable. "Sarah," he said gently, maybe we can give him a chance to show he means it." She paused, her gaze intense as she studied them both. Maybe, but don't expect me to just forget everything because of one conversation. Mark nodded, feeling the sting of her words but understanding them all the same. I don't expect that. All I'm asking is for a chance. They sat in silence for a moment, the tension heavy between them. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. What about you, Dad? What was your life like while I was wherever I was? Paul looked away, a flicker of shame passing over his face. It was empty. Every success, every achievement felt hollow. I spent every holiday, every birthday wondering where you were, wondering if you were okay. Sarah's expression softened, and she looked down, a glimmer of understanding beginning to break through her hurt. I was always waiting, you know? Even after I gave up, I still hoped, just in case. But I got used to disappointment. Paul reached for her hand again, this time with a steadier grip. You don't have to wait anymore. I'm here, Sarah. I'm not going anywhere. Mark watched, the scene unfolding before him with a gravity he hadn't anticipated. He cleared his throat, feeling the need to address the weight in the air. Sarah, I know I've been blind to a lot of things, but meeting you has opened my eyes. I want to help, not just with words, but with real action. She looked at him, wary but curious. Real action? And what does that mean for you? Mark took a deep breath. It means I'm going to do whatever I can to make up for my mistakes. If that means listening more, learning more, changing how I treat people, then I'll do it. She watched him, her expression unreadable. We'll see, Mark. Words are easy, but actions, they're different. Paul squeezed her hand, his eyes filling with tears. Sarah, please believe me. You're not alone anymore. Whatever it takes, I'm ready. Sarah let out a slow breath, her expression softening. All right, I'll give you both a chance, but just don't let me down. I can't go through that again. Mark and Paul exchanged a glance, each of them feeling the weight of her words. This was a second chance for all of them, a fragile, precious chance to rebuild what had been broken. As they sat together in the quiet warmth of the coffee shop, they knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, they were willing to face it together. After their tense but hopeful conversation at the coffee shop, Mark felt a renewed sense of determination. He had underestimated the depth of Sarah's pain, and now he was willing to do whatever it took to bridge the distance between them. But he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. He had to show his sincerity through action. Maybe we could go somewhere together, Mark suggested hesitantly as they stood outside the coffee shop, the late afternoon light casting a warm glow over the city streets. Someplace you'd like to visit, Sarah? Sarah looked at him, surprised. Her expression softened slightly, though her wariness lingered. What, like a day out? She asked skeptically, her arms crossed defensively. Yeah, Mark replied, trying to keep his tone light. Just something to help us all get to know each other better. You can pick the place, whatever you feel comfortable with. Paul nodded eagerly, his face lighting up with the possibility of spending more time with his daughter. Sarah, I'd love that. I want to know everything about your life, what you've been through, what you enjoy. I don't want to miss another moment with you. Sarah shifted on her feet, clearly wrestling with her feelings. All right, she finally agreed, her voice cautious. There's this art gallery downtown. I've always wanted to go. But let's just say I didn't think I'd fit in there. Mark and Paul exchanged a look, and Mark smiled reassuringly. Then that's exactly where we'll go. Tomorrow, maybe? Or whenever you feel ready. Sarah shrugged, her guard slightly lowered. Tomorrow's fine, I guess. I don't know. I'm not used to being treated like family. Paul's face softened, and he reached out, hesitating slightly before gently resting his hand on her shoulder. Sarah, that's what you are. My daughter. And that's never going to change again. A small, hesitant smile tugged at Sarah's lips, though a hint of sadness still lingered in her eyes. I guess we'll see, she murmured, glancing away. The next day, the three of them arrived at the gallery, each dressed with care. Mark, in his usual tailored suit, felt oddly out of place as he noticed Sarah's simpler attire. Paul, too, was dressed down, blending in with the casual crowd that milled about the gallery entrance. Inside, the gallery was bustling, the air filled with the soft hum of conversation and the faint scent of fresh paint and polished wood. Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the vibrant artwork displayed on the walls, her gaze lingering on each piece with a quiet intensity. Paul noticed and smiled warmly, stepping beside her. "You have an eye for this, don't you? Did you ever think about becoming an artist?" Sarah shrugged, her gaze still fixed on the canvas in front of her. "Maybe. I always liked drawing, but it never seemed realistic. People like me don't become artists. We're just trying to survive." Mark shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her words hitting him again. "But what if you didn't have to worry about that? What if you could do anything, be anyone you wanted to be?" She glanced at him, a slight frown creasing her forehead. "It's not that simple, Mark. You don't just decide to change your life overnight. There's a lot that holds people back. Circumstances, money, prejudice." Mark nodded, feeling humbled. "You're right. I didn't mean to make it sound easy. But maybe we could help? If there's anything you need, we're here." Sarah's expression softened slightly, but she shook her head. "I appreciate the thought, but I've been doing this alone for a long time. It's hard to just let someone in." Paul, sensing the fragility of the moment, placed a gentle hand on her back. "We're not asking you to do it alone anymore, Sarah. We're here, and we're not going anywhere." For the first time, Sarah seemed to relax, her posture softening as she let out a small, shaky breath. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Maybe I'll try to trust that." The three of them continued to move through the gallery, talking quietly, each exchange revealing small glimpses into Sarah's life, her dreams, and her fears. Mark felt his heart grow heavy as he listened, the reality of her struggles settling over him like a cold, harsh wind. He had always thought of himself as successful, capable, and wise. But standing here, next to Sarah, he felt painfully small and ignorant. As they neared the end of the gallery, a sudden voice called out, breaking their momentary peace. "Hey, excuse me." A tall, thin man in a dark suit strode toward them, his face twisted into a frown. "You can't be here. This is a private event." Mark, caught off guard, stepped forward, his hand raised placatingly. "We're here as guests. We just wanted to look at the artwork." The man's eyes narrowed as he looked over Sarah's worn jacket and simple clothing. "Guests? We're looking for donors and art patrons. Not everyone can understand the kind of art we have here." Sarah's face fell, her shoulders tensing as she looked away, a flicker of shame passing over her features. Paul, furious, took a step toward the man. "She's here as my guest, and she deserves to be here just as much as anyone else." The man sneered, dismissing Paul with a wave. "I don't know who you think you are, but this isn't a place for just anyone. This is a prestigious gallery, and we have standards to maintain." Mark, feeling his frustration bubble to the surface, spoke firmly. "And who are you to judge? We're here to appreciate art, just like everyone else." The man's gaze shifted to Mark, recognizing him as someone of influence. His expression softened slightly, but his eyes lingered on Sarah with disdain. "Of course, sir. I didn't mean any offense to you or your associates. But we must keep the atmosphere appropriate for our patrons." The humiliation was clear in Sarah's eyes, and she clenched her fists, holding back tears. She turned abruptly, walking toward the exit, her steps quick and uneven. Paul and Mark watched helplessly as she left, the momentary hope of reconciliation shattered by yet another reminder of the prejudice she faced daily. Paul looked at Mark, his face pale and lined with sorrow. "Do you see now?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is what she goes through every day." Mark nodded, his expression grim. "I see, and I'll never forget it." They followed Sarah outside, where she stood on the street corner, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She glanced up as they approached, her face a mixture of anger and pain. "See," she said bitterly, "this is why I didn't want to come. I knew it wouldn't change anything." Paul reached out, his eyes pleading. "Sarah, please, don't give up on us. Don't give up on yourself. Sarah looked away, her voice filled with a painful resignation. It's easy for you to say, Dad, but for me, this is just life. Mark stepped forward, his voice filled with conviction. No, we're going to change that, Sarah. I don't care how long it takes. You deserve better than this, and I'm going to make sure you get it. She looked at him, her eyes searching his, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained cautious. I'll believe it when I see it. They stood together on the sidewalk, the weight of the moment settling over them like a heavy fog. Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that this journey was far from over. But he was ready to face whatever came next, determined to prove that his intentions went beyond empty promises. The car ride back from the gallery was silent, thick with tension. Sarah sat in the back seat, her arms wrapped around herself, staring out the window. Paul sat beside her, stealing glances in her direction, his face marked by concern and helplessness. Up front, Mark gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, a heavy guilt settling over him like a storm cloud. As they neared Sarah's neighborhood, Mark broke the silence. Sarah, about what happened back there, Don't. Sarah interrupted, her voice flat, almost hollow. Don't try to make it better, Mark. You don't understand. This isn't just one incident. It's my whole life. Mark winced, her words landing like a punch. I know, and I can't pretend to understand everything you've been through, but I want to try to change things. I really do. Sarah scoffed, shaking her head. Change things? People like you always say that. And then, nothing changes. You just go back to your comfortable lives, while people like me stay. Invisible, Paul reached over, placing a tentative hand on her shoulder. Sarah, please, give us a chance. We're here now. I'm here now. And I don't want to let you go again. She shifted away from his touch, her expression a mixture of pain and skepticism. It's not that easy, Dad. You don't just get to show up after all these years and act like everything's okay. A heavy silence settled over them once more. Mark slowed the car as they entered a street lined with crumbling buildings, their paint chipped and faded. The sidewalks were littered with scraps of paper and broken glass, and a sense of desolation hung in the air. Paul looked around, his eyes widening. Is this where you live? He asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. Sarah glanced at him, her gaze challenging. Yeah, it's not pretty, but it's home. Mark's heart sank as he took in the bleak surroundings. Sarah, you don't have to live here. We could help you find a better place, somewhere safe. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. Safe? There's no such thing as safe for people like me. This is reality, Mark. You can't just throw money at it and make it go away. Paul's voice was thick with emotion. Sarah, please, let us help. You shouldn't have to face this alone. Sarah clenched her fists, her voice rising in frustration. Do you really think you can fix everything? Do you think just because you have money, it'll make everything okay? That's not how it works. Mark stopped the car, his voice filled with determination. Then tell us, Sarah. Tell us what we can do. We're here, and we're not leaving until you let us help. She looked at him, her gaze fierce and unyielding. Fine. You really want to help? Then start by actually seeing what it's like here. You think you understand, but you have no idea. She pushed open the car door, stepping out onto the cracked pavement. Paul and Mark exchanged a look before following her, their footsteps echoing on the quiet street. As they walked, Sarah pointed out the rundown buildings, the vacant lots littered with debris, the faces of people who watched them from behind broken windows. This is my world, she said, her voice laced with anger. This is where I grew up, where I learned not to trust anyone, because everyone leaves eventually. Paul placed a hand on his heart, visibly affected. Sarah, I didn't want to leave. I was looking for you every day, but you still left, she replied, her voice sharp. I had no one. Do you understand that? No one. Mark looked around, the harsh reality of her life sinking in. Sarah, I can't change the past, but I can change the future. I can help make this right. Sarah shook her head, her expression bitter. You think it's that easy? You think you can just walk in here, take a tour, and suddenly you understand everything? Paul's face crumpled, his voice cracking. Sarah, we're trying. I'm trying. I know I can't undo the pain, but I can be here now. Please, let us in. Sarah's hardened expression wavered for a moment, and she looked away, blinking rapidly. It's not just about being here, Dad. It's about understanding. Really understanding. Mark, sensing the rawness of her emotions, took a step closer, his voice gentle. Then teach us, Sarah. Show us what we've been blind to. I want to really see through your eyes. She looked at him, her gaze heavy with distrust but tinged with a glimmer of hope. All right, I'll show you. But don't expect it to be pretty. They continued walking through the neighborhood, passing groups of people gathered on stoops, their faces worn and weary. A child played with a deflated basketball on the cracked sidewalk, while a woman sat on a doorstep, her eyes dull and distant. Sarah gestured around them. This is what I see every day. Struggle, exhaustion, people who've given up because they have no other choice. Do you think your fancy words can change this? Mark looked around, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. No, I don't think words alone can change it, but maybe actions can. Paul, unable to hide his emotion, placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. Sarah, we can't change the world overnight, but we can be here for you, now and always. Whatever you need, I'll make sure you have it. Sarah looked at him, her face etched with pain and longing. It's hard to believe that, Dad. It's hard to believe in anything anymore. Mark spoke softly, his voice filled with sincerity. Then let us give you something to believe in, Sarah. Let us show you that we're not just words. She looked away, biting her lip. It's not that simple, Mark. Nothing about this is simple. A sudden commotion drew their attention as a young man approached them, his face angry and defiant. What are you people doing here? He demanded, his gaze fixed on Mark and Paul. You don't belong here. This isn't your world. Sarah stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. They're with me, Jake. It's okay. The young man, Jake, looked at her, his expression softening slightly. Are you sure, Sarah? These types, they don't usually come around unless they're trying to take something. Mark stepped forward, his tone respectful. We're not here to take anything. We're here because we want to learn, to understand. Jake scoffed, shaking his head. Understand? People like you don't want to understand. You just want to feel better about yourselves. Sarah placed a hand on Jake's arm, her gaze steady. Let them try, Jake. Just let them try. Jake looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of protectiveness and resignation. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. Mark and Paul exchanged a glance, both of them realizing that this journey was going to be far more difficult than they had anticipated. But they were willing to face it, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. They owed that much to Sarah and to themselves. As they walked deeper into the neighborhood, Mark felt a shift within himself, a slow, dawning awareness of the privilege and ignorance he had carried his entire life. He didn't know how, but he was determined to make this right, no matter how long it took. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over the neighborhood as Sarah, Mark, and Paul made their way through the familiar streets. The air was thick with the scents of the city, oil, dust, and the faint whiff of something frying from a nearby food stand. It was a scent Sarah had grown accustomed to, but as she saw Mark and Paul's discomfort, a familiar anger bubbled up within her. You're out of your element, aren't you? Sarah's voice was sharp, breaking the silence that had settled between them. It's easy to talk about help and understanding from your clean, polished offices. But out here, this is real life. This is my life. Mark nodded, his voice subdued. You're right, Sarah. This is something I never had to experience. But I'm here now, aren't I? Sarah stopped walking, turning to face him. Are you, though? Or are you just here because you feel guilty? Because suddenly, you want to feel like a good person for a day? Paul reached out to touch her shoulder, his face etched with sorrow. Sarah, please. We're not here to make ourselves feel better. We're here because we want to understand. Because we want to be part of your life. She looked at him, her gaze hard and unyielding. You're saying that now, Dad. But where were you when I needed someone? When I was alone? You were supposed to be there, and you weren't. Paul's face fell, a deep sadness filling his eyes. I know, Sarah, and there's nothing I can say to make up for that. But I'm here now, asking for a chance to do better. Mark watched the exchange, feeling the weight of the conversation in his chest. He cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. Sarah, I know I can't change the past. I can't erase the hurt, but maybe I can help build something better for the future. Sarah's laughter was bitter, her gaze piercing. You think it's that simple? You think you can just come into my world, wave your money around, and fix everything? It's not about money, Mark replied, his voice firm but calm. It's about making things right, or at least trying to. She took a step closer to him, her eyes narrowed. Trying? That's all you're willing to do? Try. Paul stepped between them, his voice soft but resolute. Sarah, we're here to listen, to understand. If we fail, then we'll try again. And again if we have to. Sarah looked at him, her expression a mixture of pain and anger. You don't get it, do you? I've spent my whole life watching people walk in and out. People who promised they'd be there, only to disappear when things got tough. How do I know you won't do the same? Paul's face softened, and he placed a hand on his heart. Because I can't lose you again, Sarah. I won't let that happen. Mark stepped forward, his voice steady. We're not here for a day or a week, Sarah. We're here because we want to be part of your life. For as long as you'll have us. She hesitated, the vulnerability flickering in her eyes. It's not just about wanting to be here. It's about proving it. Mark nodded, his face determined. Then let us prove it. Show us what you need, and we'll be there. Every time. Sarah's gaze softened, though her voice remained cautious. You say that now, but what happens when things get uncomfortable? When you're faced with the reality that my life isn't like yours? Paul placed a hand on her arm, his voice filled with emotion. Sarah, I understand that trust is something we have to earn, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes. Mark watched the raw vulnerability between them, feeling his own resolve solidify. Sarah, we're not just asking for forgiveness. We're asking for the chance to be there for you, to support you, no matter what. She looked at both of them, her face softening for the first time that evening. If you're serious, then maybe there's a way forward. But I need time, and I need you to show me, not just tell me. Paul's eyes filled with tears as he nodded. Anything you need, Sarah. We're here. They stood in silence, the weight of years of separation and misunderstanding finally lifting. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. And for the first time, Sarah allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. A few weeks passed after that emotional evening, and Mark kept his promise. He visited Sarah regularly, each time bringing something small, whether it was a meal, a book she had mentioned, or simply his time and attention. Each visit chipped away at the walls she had built around herself, and slowly, she began to open up, sharing parts of her life that she had guarded fiercely for so long. One crisp autumn afternoon, they sat together on the worn bench in Sarah's neighborhood park. The wind carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant street food, wrapping them in a comforting embrace. Paul joined them, settling onto the bench with a warmth that only came from familiarity. Sarah, Paul began, his tone soft and earnest. I know we've had some hard conversations, and I know trust doesn't come easily, but I want you to know that you're my family. I've missed you more than words can say. Sarah looked down, tracing patterns on the bench with her fingers. It's still strange, you know? This family thing. I'm not used to it. Mark nodded, his face softening. And we're not here to rush you. We're just here, however long it takes. Sarah gave a small smile, a flicker of warmth breaking through her usual guarded expression. It's funny. For so long, I thought I didn't need anyone. I thought I could survive on my own. And I did, in a way. But it's nice to have someone around who cares. Paul's eyes welled with tears, and he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. That's all I've ever wanted, Sarah. To be there for you, to be your father. And I know I have a lot to make up for. She nodded slowly, meeting his gaze. I'm starting to believe that. And maybe I want that too. The three of them sat in a comfortable silence, the weight of the past finally beginning to lift. Mark glanced at Sarah, his face filled with gratitude and pride. "Sarah, you've shown us more strength than I think I'll ever understand. Thank you for letting us in." She shrugged, a shy smile gracing her lips. "I guess it was time." Just as they settled into the warmth of the moment, a familiar figure approached them. The man from the gallery, his face instantly recognizable. His eyes flicked between them, landing on Sarah with a mixture of disdain and confusion. "Oh, it's you again," he sneered. "Still hanging around with people who clearly don't belong?" Mark stood, his face hardening. "This is my friend and her father," he said firmly, placing a protective arm around Sarah's shoulder. "And you are overstepping," the man scoffed, dismissing him with a wave. "You're wasting your time, Mark. People like her don't change. They're a burden, a stain on this city." Paul's face darkened, and he took a step toward the man. "You don't know anything about my daughter. She's stronger than you'll ever be, and she deserves more respect than you could ever give." Sarah took a shaky breath, feeling the sting of the man's words. But this time, she didn't flinch. She stood straighter, her head held high. "People like you are the reason I didn't believe in second chances. But I'm starting to see that it's people like them." She gestured to Mark and Paul, who prove that not everyone sees the world through such a small, hateful lens. Mark tightened his grip on her shoulder, his face a mixture of pride and determination. "Sarah is family, and I won't stand by and let anyone insult her." The man's face reddened, but he quickly turned on his heel and walked away, muttering under his breath. The three of them watched him go, the tension dissipating as he disappeared down the path. Paul looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with admiration. "I'm so proud of you, Sarah. You stood up for yourself. You didn't let him take away your dignity." Sarah's eyes softened, and she looked at him, a newfound confidence shining in her gaze. "I guess I finally believe that I don't have to be alone anymore, that I have people who actually care." Mark smiled, his voice gentle. "And you always will, Sarah, no matter what." They continued their walk through the park, the leaves crunching beneath their feet. It wasn't a perfect ending, and they all knew that healing would take time. But for the first time in years, they felt like a family, united by love, trust, and a shared determination to face the future together. As we reach the end of this moving story, it's clear that some of the most important lessons we learn in life are born from our own mistakes and the chance to make things right. Mark's journey shows us that redemption isn't about wiping away the past but owning it, facing the harm we've caused and committing to change, no matter how uncomfortable or challenging. Sarah's resilience and strength are reminders that, even after facing deep rejection, standing tall and speaking your truth is a form of power that no one can take away. And Paul's unwavering love teaches us the importance of staying, of showing up for those who need us, even when we've made mistakes. This story reflects a universal truth. It's never too late to grow, to learn, and to become the person we aspire to be. But this journey requires sincerity, humility, and action. Let this be a reminder to all of us to not just make promises, but to live up to them, to show love and support through our actions. If we can take anything away from this story, it's the importance of seeing and respecting each other's dignity, regardless of differences. Remember, the world becomes a better place when we each choose to be the light in someone's darkness. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, comment below, and share your thoughts on what resonated most with you in this story.